Life is a bit like building a house. You draft plans, pour your heart into the foundation, and hope it will stand strong against storms. But sometimes, no matter how carefully you plan, a crack forms, small and almost invisible, until it grows too large to ignore. My name is Jacob, and I've always been a dreamer. From the moment I could hold a pencil, I sketched towers and sprawling cities on napkins and notebook margins. Architecture wasn't just a career for me, it was a passion, an escape, a way to leave a lasting mark. So when I got into university to study architecture, it felt like stepping into a dream. The campus was alive with creativity and ambition, every corner buzzing with students discussing projects, debating designs, and chasing their futures. It was there that I met her. Nora. She wasn't just beautiful, she was mesmerizing, the kind of person who could steal your breath with a glance. Her laughter was a melody, light and infectious, drawing everyone to her orbit. Nora had an effortless charm, the kind that left people spellbound. She was the star of our course, not just for her looks but for her confidence, wit, and magnetic personality. We first truly connected during an intra-school competition. Teams of architecture students were tasked with designing a sustainable community center within 48 hours. Fate, or perhaps luck, paired us together. Working alongside Nora was exhilarating and infuriating all at once. She was bold, always challenging my ideas and pushing boundaries, and yet she had this infectious energy that made it impossible not to match her intensity. Our team won first place. That night, as we celebrated under the campus lights, Nora looked at me with a smile that felt different, personal. Her words, light and teasing, lingered in my mind long after. "See, Jacob, I told you we'd win. You just had to trust me." From that night on, we were inseparable, or at least, it felt that way. But there was someone else I hadn't fully noticed yet. Someone who lingered quietly in the background of those university days, Rosa. Rosa was Nora's roommate in the dormitory, and they couldn't have been more different. When Nora was radiant and bold, Rosa was gentle and reserved. She had this quiet grace about her, a warmth that didn't demand attention but drew it nonetheless. Her smile was soft, almost shy, and her eyes carried a depth that made you feel seen. Their relationship was curious. Nora often treated Rosa more like a sidekick than a friend, using her for favors or as an audience for her jokes. And yet Rosa, with her tender nature, never seemed to mind, or at least, she never let it show. I didn't think much of Rosa back then. I was too captivated by Nora's brilliance. But there were moments, fleeting and subtle, where I'd catch Rosa watching me from across the room. Her gaze wasn't bold or demanding, it was soft, as if she couldn't help herself. The moment I noticed, she'd look away, her cheeks coloring with embarrassment. Graduation came faster than I'd expected, bringing with it the end of those carefree university days. By then, Nora and I were officially a couple. Everyone said we made the perfect pair, her charisma balancing my quiet determination. We moved in together after university, and a year later, we got married. I had landed a job at a prestigious architecture firm, the kind of place that demanded long hours but offered limitless potential. Nora, on the other hand, had no interest in work. She thrived on planning our social life, filling it with parties, weekend getaways, and every kind of adventure she could imagine. At first, I loved her energy, the way she made life feel vibrant and unpredictable. But as the demands of my career grew, so did the distance between us. Late nights at the office left little time for the picnics and parties Nora loved. She seemed to fill the gap with other things, fitness classes, photography sessions, horseback riding. She was always busy, always moving, always glowing with the energy of a life well lived. I told myself it was normal. We were simply adjusting to the realities of marriage, finding our rhythms. And yet there were moments, quiet, unspoken moments, where doubt crept in. Missed dinners, vague explanations, and the way she seemed to grow more distant with each passing day. And then there was Rosa. She reappeared in my life in small, unexpected ways. A chance meeting at a grocery store, an occasional message to ask how I was doing. Her presence was like a soft light in the background of my increasingly chaotic world. Rosa listened when I spoke about my work, her eyes warm with understanding. She offered advice, encouragement, and above all, a quiet kindness that felt like a lifeline. At the time, I told myself it was just friendship. Nothing more. After all, I was married to Nora, the woman I had chosen, the woman I loved. Or at least, the woman I thought I loved. Looking back, the signs were already there. The cracks in our foundation were forming, small and imperceptible, but growing with each passing day. I didn't want to see them. I didn't want to believe that the life I'd built with Nora could crumble. But life doesn't care about what you want to believe. It cares about the truth, and the truth was waiting just around the corner, ready to shatter everything I thought I knew. Charleston was a city straight out of a postcard, its streets lined with grand oak trees draped in Spanish moss and colorful townhouses exuding southern charm. When Nora and I first moved there after our wedding, it felt like the perfect place to begin our life together, a canvas ready for us to paint our dreams. The architecture captivated me. Its historic homes, with intricate ironwork balconies and sprawling verandas, were more than just buildings. They were stories carved in wood and stone. "This is it, Jacob," Nora had said the day we arrived, her voice filled with excitement as she looked out of the car window. "This is where we're going to build everything." I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "It's beautiful," I replied, taking in the cobblestone streets and pastel facades. At that moment, I believed her words. It felt like the start of something solid, something permanent. We rented a charming two-story house just outside the historic district. The house had character, wide plank wooden floors, a wraparound porch, and a view of the marshes that seemed to shimmer in the golden light of the setting sun. Nora loved it instantly. "This porch is perfect for hosting," she said, twirling around with a smile. "Imagine the parties we could have here. Twinkling lights, music, wine." I nodded, though my mind was already drifting to the city itself. Charleston felt like a living, breathing architectural museum. Each day on my way to work, I would take detours just to admire the centuries-old buildings, the Gothic churches, and the quaint charm of the row houses. For an architect like me, it was a dream. Nora, however, was less captivated by the history and more by the energy of the town. She quickly immersed herself in Charleston's social scene, joining clubs, attending events, and making friends with ease. She was radiant in every room she entered, a magnet for attention and admiration. It was a side of her I had always admired, but as the months passed, it became clear that her social calendar didn't often include me. My work demanded long hours. I was working on a project for a luxury waterfront development, a dream commission that had the potential to propel my career forward. I poured myself into every detail, staying late at the office to perfect renderings and presentations. I convinced myself that it was for us, that these long hours would pay off, allowing us to build the life we'd always talked about. But Nora didn't see it that way. "You're always working, Jacob," she said one night as we sat on the porch. She was scrolling through her phone, her wine glass half empty on the small table between us. "You need to make time for life, for us." I sighed, leaning back in the wicker chair. "I'm doing this for us, Nora. You know that. This project could set us up for years." Her lips curved into a half-smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if you love your buildings more than you love me." I laughed softly, thinking she was joking, but the look she gave me made my laughter die in my throat. "Nora, come on. You know that's not true." She shrugged, sipping her wine. "Maybe. But it feels that way sometimes." Despite our growing distance, I tried to hold on to the moments that felt like the old Nora, the Nora I fell in love with. Like the weekends when we'd walk through the farmer's market together, her arm looped through mine, her laughter lighting up the morning. Or the quiet evenings when she'd sit on the porch with me, the two of us watching fireflies dance in the marsh as the sky turned shades of pink and orange. But those moments became rarer as time went on. Nora threw herself deeper into her activities, Pilates classes, horseback riding lessons, volunteering at charity events. She was always busy, always surrounded by people. It was as though she was filling her life with everything but me. Then there was the night of the gala. Nora had been talking about it for weeks. A black-tie event hosted by one of her new friends, an influential socialite named Claire. "You'll come, won't you?" she'd asked, her eyes shining with excitement. "It's going to be amazing." I'd promised her I would, but the night of the gala, I found myself stuck at the office, buried in deadlines. By the time I got home, it was nearly midnight. Nora wasn't back yet. When she finally walked through the door, her cheeks flushed from wine and laughter, she barely seemed to notice my presence. She was dressed in an elegant navy gown that shimmered with every movement, her hair styled in soft waves. For a moment, I was struck by how beautiful she looked. "You're late," she said, her tone light but her words sharp. "I'm sorry," I replied, running a hand through my hair. "I tried to get out sooner, but the project." She waved her hand dismissively. "Of course. The project. It's always the project. Nora, don't do this. I wanted to be there." "Then you should have been," she snapped, her smile vanishing. "But it's fine, Jacob. I had a great time without you." Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. She turned and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room with nothing but the sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. As weeks turned into months, I noticed other changes. Her phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter or sofa, now rarely left her hand. Her explanations for late nights grew vaguer, her laughter more hollow when she recounted her days. The Nora I knew was slipping away, replaced by someone I couldn't quite recognize. And yet, amidst the unraveling of my marriage, Rosa reappeared. One afternoon, I ran into her at a local coffee shop. She was sitting at a corner table, a book in her hand, her face soft and serene. When she saw me, her eyes lit up with genuine warmth. "Jacob," she said, her smile gentle. "It's been a while." "Rosa," I replied, surprised at how comforting it felt to see her. "What are you doing in Charleston?" "I moved here a few months ago," she said, gesturing for me to join her. "It seemed like the right place for a fresh start." We talked for over an hour, catching up on life and reminiscing about university. She asked about Nora, her questions polite but curious. I found myself opening up more than I intended, confessing that things between Nora and me weren't as perfect as they seemed. Rosa listened quietly, her presence a balm to my frayed nerves. As I left the cafe that day, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months: hope. But hope, like a building with a cracked foundation, can only hold up for so long. Charleston in the spring is a study in contrasts. The city blooms with azaleas and dogwoods, a celebration of life and renewal, but for me, those days marked the beginning of decay. My marriage to Nora, once a vibrant and dynamic partnership, or so I believed, was turning into something fragile and strained. It wasn't one specific moment that tipped me off. It was a collection of small changes, almost imperceptible at first, like hairline cracks in a facade. Nora's laughter, once so full of warmth, now seemed lighter, rehearsed, as if it belonged to someone else. She was distracted, always on her phone, texting someone with a faint smile she didn't bother to explain. I told myself it was nothing. She had friends, she was social. It was just who she was. But that quiet voice in the back of my mind grew louder, insisting something was wrong. One Friday evening, I came home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise her. My firm had wrapped up a presentation ahead of schedule, and I decided to bring home takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant. As I opened the door, the house was dark, quiet. I set the food on the counter and called out her name. "Nora?" No response. I walked into the living room, noticing the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. On the coffee table was an empty wine glass, a detail that seemed insignificant but gnawed at me nonetheless. She hadn't mentioned going out that night, and yet she was gone. Pulling out my phone, I sent her a text. "Hey, where are you? I brought dinner." Her reply came almost instantly. "Oh, sorry. I'm out with Claire and the girls. I'll eat later." Don't wait up! The words felt hollow, rushed. There was no warmth, no apology, just a vague excuse. I stared at the screen, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her, not yet. The next day, I decided to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking things, letting work stress cloud my judgment. I tried to focus on my projects, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Nora. Every time her phone buzzed, she seemed quick to shield the screen, offering a half-smile as if to reassure me. It didn't. A week later, I found myself at the grocery store, picking up a few things for dinner. As I rounded the corner of the produce aisle, I almost bumped into Rosa. She was examining a bag of oranges, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Rosa?" I said, surprised. Her face lit up when she saw me. "Jacob!" "Hi! What a nice surprise!" We exchanged pleasantries, and as we talked, I felt a strange sense of calm. Rosa had always had that effect on me. Her presence was grounding, like a familiar melody you hadn't heard in years but still knew by heart. As we parted ways, she gave me a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Jacob. You look tired." I nodded, forcing a laugh. "Work's been hectic." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment before she turned to leave. "If you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Her words stayed with me long after I got home. It wasn't just work that was making me tired. It was Nora, the uncertainty, the distance, the way she seemed to be slipping through my fingers. It was a Tuesday evening when the first undeniable crack in our marriage appeared. Nora was in the shower, her phone left on the nightstand. I wasn't proud of what I did, but curiosity, or desperation, got the better of me. I picked it up, telling myself it was just to silence the buzzing notifications. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw a name I didn't recognize, Phil. The text preview read, "Looking forward to seeing you again soon. Last night was amazing, winky face." My chest tightened as I stared at the words, the world around me fading into a dull hum. My hands trembled as I unlocked her phone. The messages between her and Phil were explicit, flirty, familiar. They told a story I didn't want to believe but couldn't deny. The sound of the shower stopped, and I quickly placed the phone back on the nightstand, my heart pounding. Nora walked into the bedroom moments later, wrapped in a towel, her hair damp and clinging to her shoulders. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone casual as she glanced at me. I forced a smile, shaking my head. "Yeah. Just tired." She didn't seem to notice the edge in my voice. She hummed softly as she moved around the room, getting ready for bed, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. I stared at blueprints and models, but all I could see were the messages on Nora's phone. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but I brushed off their concerns, retreating to my office to wrestle with my thoughts. Should I confront her? Was I jumping to conclusions? Could there be some innocent explanation? But deep down, I knew the truth. That evening I called Rosa. I didn't tell her everything, just that I was struggling. She didn't press me for details, only listened as I stumbled over my words, trying to make sense of my feelings. "Jacob," she said softly, "you deserve honesty. From yourself and from her." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Honesty. It was such a simple concept, but it felt impossible in that moment. As I hung up the phone, I resolved to confront Nora. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in the limbo of suspicion and doubt. Whatever the truth was, I needed to hear it from her. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. The very next evening, Nora came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. She smelled faintly of expensive cologne that wasn't hers. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Yeah. Meetings ran late." "Nora," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "Who's Phil?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise, and something else. Fear. For a moment she said nothing, her lips parting as if to speak but no words coming out. I saw the messages. I continued, my chest tight. Don't lie to me. Her face paled, and she looked away, her hands trembling. Jacob. I can explain. Then explain, I said, my voice breaking. But her explanation wasn't what I hoped for. It was full of half-truths and excuses, a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. And as she spoke, the crack in our foundation turned into a chasm, one I knew we could never repair. After our confrontation, Nora became a shadow in the house, present but distant, like a guest overstaying their welcome. She had offered no real explanations, just a flurry of vague excuses that only deepened my suspicion. I wasn't ready to give up on my marriage, but the trust between us was fractured, and I didn't know how to fix it. The days blurred together, a dull routine of work and silence at home. Then came the day that would strip away any illusions I had left. It was a Thursday afternoon when I met Phil. I'd been assigned a new project, a sleek, modern vacation home for a wealthy client. It was the kind of commission architects dream about, a chance to design without compromise. I'd spent hours on the initial drafts and was eager to get the client's feedback. After a few phone calls, Phil, the client, suggested I come to his house to discuss the details. Phil's home was everything you'd expect from a man of his status, sprawling, opulent, and utterly devoid of warmth. The kind of place designed to impress rather than to live in. As I stepped into the marble-floored foyer, I was greeted by Phil himself, a man in his mid-40s with a sharp suit, a stronger cologne than necessary, and the smug confidence of someone who always gets what he wants. "Jacob," he said, clapping me on the back as if we were old friends. "Glad you could make it. Let's get down to business, yeah?" We moved to his study, a room that smelled of leather and whiskey. Phil lounged in a chair, sipping from a tumbler as I laid out the blueprints on the desk. He nodded along as I explained the design, interjecting occasionally with comments that made it clear he had more money than taste. Then, out of nowhere, he leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You know, Jacob, this place isn't just for me. It's a retreat. A place to unwind, you know? Bring a few babes over, have a little fun." I forced a polite smile, unsure how to respond. "Well, I'm sure it'll be a great space for that." Phil laughed, a deep, arrogant sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, it will be. In fact," he leaned forward, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Take a look at this. My latest catch. Isn't she something?" He handed me his phone, and for a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. There, on the screen, was a photo of Nora. She was sitting on the edge of what looked like a hotel bed, wearing a tight black dress I didn't recognize, her smile coy and flirtatious. The caption read, "Last night's treat, winky face." My chest constricted, the air knocked out of me. I must have gone pale because Phil raised an eyebrow. "You okay there, buddy?" I handed the phone back, my hand trembling. "Yeah. Just, the design's fine as is." I didn't stay much longer. I mumbled something about revising the plans and left as quickly as I could, my mind racing. The drive home was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. The image of Nora burned into my mind, erasing any hope that there was some innocent explanation for her behavior. When I got home, she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, wondering how the woman I had loved could have become a stranger. "Nora," I said, my voice cold and sharp. She looked up, startled by my tone. "Jacob? What's wrong?" I stepped closer, pulling out my phone. "I met Phil today. Your friend." Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. I showed her the photo. "This is you, isn't it? Don't even try to deny it." She stared at the screen, her hands trembling. "Jacob, Save it," I snapped, my voice rising. "Do you even realize what you've done? You didn't just betray me, you humiliated me. My client. My work. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "It wasn't like that," she said weakly. It wasn't serious. Not serious? I laughed bitterly. That's your excuse? You destroyed our marriage for something not serious? Was it worth it, Nora? Was he worth it? She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. Jacob, I made a mistake. I was lonely. You were always working, and I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. That's a pathetic excuse, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You could have talked to me. You could have tried. But instead you chose this. She reached for me, but I stepped back. Jacob, please. I love you. I don't want to lose you. You already did, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That night, I slept in the guest room, unable to bear the thought of being near her. The house felt cold, the air thick with tension and the echoes of our argument. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life had unraveled so completely. The next morning, Nora tried to act as if everything could go back to normal, but the silence between us was deafening. I went through the motions of my day, but my mind was elsewhere, consumed by anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sadness. I wasn't ready to make any decisions yet, but one thing was clear: the woman I thought I knew was gone, and I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. The days after the confrontation were a haze of silence and unease. Nora and I moved through the house like strangers, careful not to cross paths more than necessary. I spent most of my time at the office or out on site visits, trying to avoid the suffocating tension that now filled our home. But no matter how much I worked, I couldn't outrun my thoughts. The image of Nora on Phil's phone was seared into my mind, a cruel reminder of her betrayal. I couldn't help but replay every moment of our marriage, questioning what was real and what was just another lie. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the dim light of the kitchen, a glass of whiskey in hand. I stared at the swirling amber liquid, trying to make sense of my emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion, they all churned inside me, refusing to settle. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. I looked up to see Nora standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant. She wore one of the oversized sweaters she always claimed were her comfort clothes, but even that felt like a facade now. Jacob, she began softly, her voice trembling. Can we talk? I gestured to the seat across from me. Go ahead. She sat down, her hands clasped tightly together. For a moment she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the table. Then she spoke, her words spilling out in a rush. I'm sorry. For everything. For Phil, for lying, for hurting you. I never wanted this to happen. Then why did it? I asked, my voice cold. You don't just accidentally cheat on your husband, Nora. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. I don't know. I was lonely. You were always at work, and I felt invisible. Phil made me feel noticed. Invisible? I scoffed, anger flaring. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to build this life for us? Everything I've done has been for you, for us. She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. I know, Jacob. I know. But somewhere along the way, we stopped being a team. You were always busy, and I didn't know how to reach you. Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Part of me wanted to believe her, to see this as a cry for help rather than a betrayal. But the hurt was too fresh, the wound too raw. And sleeping with Phil, that was your solution, I said, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. She flinched at my words but didn't respond. The silence between us was deafening, filled with everything we couldn't say. Finally she stood up, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweater. I know I can't fix this, she said quietly. But I hope, someday, you'll be able to forgive me. She walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that our marriage could be salvaged. But deep down, I knew the truth: some cracks are too deep to repair. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into work with a single-minded intensity, hoping it would dull the pain. It didn't. If anything, the long hours only gave my mind more time to wander, replaying the past in a futile attempt to understand where it all went wrong. I started avoiding the house altogether, staying late at the office or wandering the streets of Charleston aimlessly. It was during one of these late-night walks that I found myself standing outside a small coffee shop. The lights were still on, and through the window, I saw her, Rosa. She was sitting at a table near the window, a book in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. She looked peaceful, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the overhead lights. For a moment I hesitated, unsure if I should go in. But something about her presence drew me in, like a lighthouse guiding a ship through a storm. "Jacob?" she said, her voice laced with surprise as I approached her table. "Hi, Rosa," I replied, managing a weak smile. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course not." She closed her book and gestured to the seat across from her. "You look tired." "I am," I admitted, sitting down. "It's been a rough few weeks." She didn't press me for details, just gave me a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes life throws more at us than we think we can handle. But you're stronger than you realize." Her words, simple as they were, struck a chord. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone truly saw me, not as a broken husband or a distracted architect, but as a person struggling to find his footing. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. Rosa had always been a good listener, her presence calming and steady. She didn't offer solutions or platitudes, she just let me speak, her quiet support more comforting than any advice. As the days turned into weeks, my encounters with Rosa became more frequent. We'd meet for coffee or take walks along the waterfront, talking about life and dreams and everything in between. She never pried into my marriage, but her presence was a balm to my wounded heart. Nora noticed the change, though she didn't say anything. She moved through the house like a ghost, her attempts at reconciliation growing less frequent. It was as if she knew the end was coming but didn't have the strength to fight it. And maybe I didn't either. Not anymore. One evening, as I sat on the porch with Rosa, watching the sun set over the marsh, I realized something profound. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. Rosa didn't fill the silence with empty words or try to distract me from my pain. She simply sat beside me, her presence enough to remind me that life could still hold beauty, even in the midst of heartache. I glanced at her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "Thank you, Rosa, for everything." She looked at me, her eyes warm and understanding. "You don't have to thank me, Jacob. That's what friends are for." Friends. The word felt both comforting and bittersweet. Because deep down, I knew that Rosa was becoming more than just a friend to me. She was becoming my lifeline, my anchor. And I couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere along the way, she had been waiting for me all along. The line between what I wanted to believe and what I knew to be true blurred more with each passing day. Nora and I barely spoke, our conversations reduced to hollow exchanges about household chores and logistical details. Her attempts to reconnect grew weaker, and I made no effort to bridge the widening chasm between us. Instead, I buried myself in my work and my growing friendship with Rosa. But even her calming presence couldn't erase the questions that gnawed at me. How had it come to this? Was I blind to the signs, or had I chosen to ignore them out of convenience or pride? One afternoon, I decided to look for answers. I'd taken the day off, unable to focus on blueprints and deadlines. Nora was out, where, she hadn't said, and I hadn't asked. As I stood in the quiet of our shared home, a sense of unease crept over me. This house, which had once felt warm and alive, now seemed like a museum of memories I no longer trusted. My gaze fell on Nora's desk in the corner of the living room. She rarely used it, preferring to lounge on the couch or the porch with her laptop. But something about that desk called to me, as if it held pieces of the puzzle I was trying to solve. I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to do settling over me. But the pull of curiosity, or desperation, was too strong to resist. I opened the drawer. At first, it seemed ordinary, scattered receipts, old notebooks, pens, and a few printed itineraries for charity events. But beneath the clutter, I found something that made my breath hitch, a stack of printed emails. The first few were harmless enough, messages about volunteer work and fitness classes. But then I saw his name. Phil. The emails weren't explicit, but they were intimate in a way that left no room for doubt. Plans to meet at hotels, comments about how much he enjoyed their time together, and even veiled references to conversations about me. I sat there, the papers trembling in my hands, a strange numbness washing over me. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was the effort, the planning, the sheer audacity of it all. Nora hadn't just stumbled into an affair, she had built it, brick by brick, like one of my designs. That evening, I waited for her to come home. She arrived just after 7, her expression wary when she saw me sitting in the living room. I wasn't drinking this time, and I wasn't pacing. I was calm, too calm, the stack of emails sitting on the coffee table in front of me. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tight as she glanced at the papers. "You tell me," I replied evenly, gesturing for her to sit. "These are yours, after all." Her face paled as she picked up the top email, her eyes scanning the words. She didn't even try to deny it this time. Instead, she sank onto the couch, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said softly. "That's what you're worried about?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Not the fact that you cheated, not the fact that you lied to me for months, but the way I found out." She didn't respond, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. "Nora," I continued, leaning forward. "Why? Just tell me why." She looked up at me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I don't know, Jacob. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I felt like something was missing." "Missing?" I repeated, my voice rising. "We had a life, Nora. A good life. Wasn't that enough for you?" She shook her head, her tears finally spilling over. "I don't know, okay? I was selfish. I wasn't thinking about you, or us, or anything other than what I wanted in the moment." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no excuse, no justification, just a brutal honesty that left me hollow. I leaned back, running a hand through my hair, my mind racing. "And Phil?" I asked after a long silence. "What is he to you?" Her lips parted, but no words came. That silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and replaying her words over and over. I thought of the life we'd built, the dreams we'd shared, and the promises we'd made. It was all gone now, reduced to ashes by her betrayal. But amidst the pain, another thought crept in: Rosa. She had been my anchor through all of this, a constant source of support and understanding. I thought of her quiet strength, her kindness, and the way she listened without judgment. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility of a future with someone who truly saw me. The next morning, I called Rosa. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm and steady. "Jacob," she said. "Are you okay?" "No," I admitted. "But I'd like to talk. Can we meet?" "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "The usual coffee shop?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thank you, Rosa. For everything. Always," she said softly. As I hung up, I felt a glimmer of hope, a faint light breaking through the shadows. My marriage was in ruins, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild. Not with Nora, but with someone who had been quietly waiting all along. The coffee shop was quiet when I arrived, the soft hum of conversations blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. Rosa was already there, sitting at our usual table near the window. She looked up as I approached, her eyes warm with concern. "Jacob," she said, her voice soft. "You look exhausted." I gave her a small, weary smile as I sat down. "I feel it." She reached across the table, her hand brushing against mine for a brief moment before retreating. "What happened?" For a moment, I couldn't find the words. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the lies, the confrontation with Nora, hung heavy in my chest. But Rosa had always been a safe harbor, and I knew I could trust her. "I found emails," I said finally, my voice low. "Between Nora and Phil." Her brows furrowed, and she nodded slowly, as if piecing the story together. So it's true. I let out a bitter laugh. It's true. She didn't even deny it this time. She said she felt bored. Like something was missing. Rosa's expression softened, her eyes searching mine. And you? How are you holding up? I don't know, I admitted. Angry. Hurt. Numb mostly. I thought I could save it, you know. That maybe there was something left to fight for. But now I'm not so sure. Rosa nodded, her gaze steady. Sometimes, letting go is the only way to move forward. Her words settled over me like a quiet truth. I hadn't let go, not really. Even after everything, I'd been clinging to the idea of what Nora and I once had. But the reality was clear now, whatever we'd built together was gone. Later that evening, I returned home to find Nora in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, a nostalgic reminder of the early days of our marriage when she used to cook for us every weekend. Hey, she said without looking up. I made dinner. I leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment. We need to talk. Her hands stilled, and she turned to face me. What about? Us, I said simply. What happens next? She sighed, setting the spoon down on the counter. Jacob, I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. I can fix this. How? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. You can't undo what you've done, Nora. You can't erase the lies or the betrayal. I'll do whatever it takes, she said, her voice trembling. Therapy, counseling, anything. I don't want to lose you. I shook my head, the bitterness rising in my chest. You don't get it, do you? You already lost me. The moment you chose Phil, the moment you decided I wasn't enough, that's when this ended. Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. You've been spending a lot of time with Rosa, she said, her voice sharp with accusation. Maybe you're not as innocent as you think. I stared at her, stunned. You don't get to turn this around on me, Nora. Rosa has been nothing but supportive while you were out with Phil, betraying everything we built. She crossed her arms, her tears forgotten. You think she's innocent? She's been waiting for this, Jacob. Waiting for you to fall apart so she can swoop in and take my place. Stop, I said firmly. Rosa is the only person who's been honest with me. She's the one who's been there when you weren't. Her face twisted with anger, and she stepped closer. If you think she's so perfect, then maybe you should be with her. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to respond. But instead of rising to it, I simply turned and walked away. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, I met with a divorce attorney. It was a quiet, clinical process, filled with paperwork and legal jargon that felt surreal. I'd never imagined my marriage would end like this, in an office filled with the sound of shuffling papers and the click of a pen. But as I signed the documents, a strange sense of relief washed over me. This was the first step toward freedom, toward rebuilding my life. When I got home, Nora was waiting for me. She must have seen the folder in my hands because her face fell, her eyes filling with fresh tears. It's over, isn't it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I said simply. It's over. She didn't argue this time. Instead, she nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I'll pack my things. As she disappeared down the hallway, I felt a pang of sadness, not for her, but for what we'd lost. There had been love once, real and tangible, but it had slipped through our fingers like sand. And now, all that remained were memories. That evening I called Rosa. It's done, I said when she answered. I filed for divorce. There was a pause on the other end of the line before she spoke. How do you feel? Relieved, I admitted. And scared. But mostly relieved. I'm proud of you, she said softly. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, I said. But it was necessary. We talked for a while, her voice a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. And as I hung up, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. Rosa wasn't just my friend. She was my future. And maybe, just maybe, this time I'd finally found someone who would choose me, flaws and all.